Hello everyone. Tonight we are taking you way back to a time when Rome wasn't yet an empire, and Carthage still smelled like trade winds and ambition. This is the beginning of one of the most iconic rivalries in ancient history, a tale that's less Romeo and Juliet, and more, I hate you, and I brought elephants. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. I mean, you're about to hear how ancient generals crossed the freaking Alps with elephants, and if that's not worthy of a thumbs up, I'm not sure what is. And don't forget to comment with your local time and where you're listening from. I love seeing where our little bedtime army is tuning in from. Now, turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soft background music, and let's get started tonight. It all began over something small, not a queen or a betrayal, just an island, Sicily, sitting in the Mediterranean like the last slice of pizza that two people lock eyes on at the same time. For centuries, Carthage had traded, colonized, and thrived along the African coast. But as Rome grew stronger, it looked south and said, "Hey, that's our pizza." Carthage and Rome were never going to be friends. One was a seafaring powerhouse with a thing for silver and trade. The other, a land-hungry republic with a senate full of grumpy old men and an obsession with order. Their first real spat was over control of Sicily, which sparked the First Punic War. It dragged on for over 20 years. Yes, 20, and in the end, Rome came out on top. Like a kid who wins a food fight and demands dessert. The Carthaginians didn't take the loss well. And by didn't take it well, I mean they spent years brooding, raising armies, and looking at maps like, "We'll show them." One of the loudest voices in that post-war pout party, Hamilcar Barca, a brilliant general and proud Carthaginian. He hated Rome with a passion so hot it could probably melt a bronze statue. When he wasn't fighting, he was raising his sons to share the same fire. Boy, did one of them turn out to be a prodigy. But we'll get to Hannibal soon. After losing Sicily, Carthage looked west to Spain. Spain, with its gold, its soldiers, its scenic mountain passes, and its very strategic location. The Carthaginians moved in, slowly building a new power base. And even though Rome grumbled, it mostly let them, thinking, well, at least they're not in Italy. Big mistake, Rome. Big. Here's where it gets a little weird. There's actually a report, unverified, of course, that Carthaginian merchants once tried to trade with Atlantic islanders who used turtle shells as currency. Not particularly relevant, but hey, it paints a picture of just how far Carthage was willing to go to build their empire. Back in Rome, the Senate was starting to twitch. They saw Carthage growing stronger again, and if there's one thing Roman senators hated more than public nudity, it was a powerful neighbor. So tensions simmered down. History books make it sound like this all escalated in a logical, strategic way, but really, it was more like two kids yelling, "You started it," back and forth across the Mediterranean for decades. And somewhere in the middle of all this, a little boy in Carthage, watching his father plot revenge. The stage was set. Carthage had the motive, Rome had the fear, and somewhere, an elephant was probably wondering what it was being trained for. Historians still debate whether Carthage ever intended to fight a second war, if it was simply inevitable. But one thing is clear, the seeds of rivalry had been planted deep, and trust me, they were about to sprout into something unforgettable. Spain, or as the Carthaginians fondly called it, the land of second chances. After licking their wounds from the First Punic War, they turned their eyes westward, away from Rome's judgmental gaze, and into that fertile, mineral-rich frontier rode Hamilcar Barca, determined to turn Carthage's next chapter into something Rome would regret. Hamilcar wasn't just some salty general with a grudge, he was a mastermind, charismatic, battle-hardened, and probably the kind of dad who taught sword drills before breakfast. He had one goal: build an empire strong enough to challenge Rome again. Spain offered gold, iron, and plenty of manpower, not to mention hills. That echoed nicely when you yelled, "Death to Rome." Alongside him was his son, young Hannibal, who, at just 9 years old, allegedly swore a blood oath to destroy Rome. Picture it, a solemn little boy, hand on an altar, eyes blazing like a mini Sith Lord, while his father nodded approvingly. Parenting in the ancient world always so light and breezy. And yes, that oath has become one of the most famous moments in ancient history. Did it actually happen? Historians still debate whether it was real or just propaganda, because let's be honest, it does sound like something written to hype up a movie trailer. In a world where one boy swore vengeance, while Hamilcar expanded the Carthaginian footprint across Iberia, he made local alliances, fought tribal wars, and set up fortified cities. He also died rather inconveniently, leaving his son Hasdrubal the Fair in charge. And true to his name, Hasdrubal kept things surprisingly calm. He signed a treaty with Rome establishing the Ebro River as the northern boundary of Carthaginian power. Everything south was fair game, everything north, Rome's problem. Now, Hannibal wasn't the type to sit on the sidelines. When Hasdrubal was assassinated because politics, naturally, Hannibal took command of the Carthaginian forces in Spain at the tender age of 26. Just 26. Some people peak early, others accidentally burned toast. And from the moment he took charge, it was clear Hannibal wasn't going to wait for Rome to attack. He started by conquering the city of Saguntum, which just so happened to be south of the Abrabut under Rome's protection. That's like kicking over your neighbor's mailbox while glaring at their security camera. Rome was furious, and just like that, boom, the Second Punic War was on. Here's the strange part. The people of Saguntum, in their final desperate days, allegedly sent a messenger to Rome by swimming across the Mediterranean. Was it true? Probably not. But imagine the commitment, or the blisters. Hannibal knew the Roman response would be swift and brutal, so instead of waiting for them to march into Spain, he decided to do something so bold, so insane, that it still boggles the mind today. He would take the war to Italy, by land, over the Alps. With elephants. Now pause, take a breath, and let's appreciate the absurdity of that sentence. Most armies struggle with a rainy day. Hannibal's solution: let's cross icy death mountains with jungle animals. The Alps were steep, treacherous, and filled with hostile tribes. The elephants were not exactly and yet, to Hannibal, it was the only way to catch Rome off guard. And one last weird detail. It's said that Hannibal carried a small flask of poison in a ring he wore just in case things went south. Fashion and function. As his army began. Their legendary march, tens of thousands of soldiers, horses, pack animals, and yes, the elephant's Europe held its breath. Rome had never seen an invasion from the north. They were preparing for another Spanish campaign. Instead, Hannibal was about to knock on their front door. It was madness. It was genius. It was Hannibal Barca, and he hadn't even reached the mountains yet. The Alps, majestic, snow-covered, and utterly unforgiving. For most, they were a natural barrier. For Hannibal, they were an inconvenient detour on the road to vengeance. But nothing, not Roman treaties, not icy cliffs, and certainly not logic could stop him now. Let's just pause for a second and acknowledge the audacity here. Hannibal had nearly 100,000 men and animals at the start of the journey, including about 37 war elephants. These weren't miniature elephants bred for cold weather. These were massive North African creatures, more used to desert heat than alpine blizzards. You can almost picture the elephants giving Hannibal the side eye, like, "Are you sure about this, boss?" Crossing the Alps wasn't a stroll through a snowy postcard. It was weeks of freezing nights, sheer vertical climbs, landslides, and local tribes throwing rocks from above. Literally, not metaphors, actual boulders were involved. But the Carthaginians pushed forward. One ancient source claims that Hannibal used fire and vinegar to crack through a rock slide. He supposedly heated rocks with fire, doused them with vinegar, and shattered them with hammers. Sounds like something you'd find on an ancient cooking show. Today on Stonebreaking with Hannibal, modern historians remain skeptical of the vinegar trick. More likely, it was good old-fashioned engineering, elbow grease, and some desperate yelling in Punic. But the story lives on, because, honestly, it's too bizarre not to. Meanwhile, the soldiers began to die. Snowstorms and starvation chipped away at morale. Pack animals slipped off cliffs. Elephants, although surprisingly resilient, struggled to find food or firm footing. It's estimated that over half of Hannibal's forces perished during the crossing, and yet they made it. When the Carthaginian army finally emerged on the Italian side, they looked like an army dragged from the underworld, emaciated, frostbitten, but absolutely battle-ready. Hannibal gathered his surviving men and gave a rousing speech, at least, according to legend. He pointed to the fertile Po valley below and said, "There lies Rome." Imagine being a Roman farmer, enjoying a normal day, when suddenly a frostbitten army appears from the mountains, elephants included. "Honey, I think someone brought war to the north." Now here's your fun off-topic detail. One of Hannibal's elephants named Surus, allegedly wore armor and had a broken tusk. He also might have been Hannibal's personal mount. So yes, somewhere in history there was a war elephant with bling and a dental issue leading a surprise mountain invasion. We don't deserve history. Rome, of course, went into panic mode. They hadn't expected an attack from the Alps. 2 consuls were dispatched to intercept Hannibal. One of them, Publius Cornelius Scipio, had actually just sailed to Spain to fight Hannibal, only to find out the guy had already left and was crashing through northern Italy. The first real clash happened at the Battle of the Ticinus River. Cavalry outmaneuvered the Romans and left Scipio wounded. He was saved by a young teenage officer, his son, Scipio the Younger, who would later become Hannibal's greatest rival. Talk about foreshadowing. This battle was just a warm-up. Hannibal was far from done. Next came the Battle of the Trebia River, where Hannibal used one of his favorite tricks, ambushes. He lured the Romans into a river crossing on a freezing morning, let them get soaked and exhausted, then struck from the flanks with hidden troops. It was a slaughter. Rome lost thousands of men. Hannibal barely lost sleep. And let's not forget his secret weapon. He understood psychological warfare. Before battles, he would often release captured Italian soldiers back home with a message: "I'm not your enemy. Rome is." He wanted to split the Roman alliances from within. Manipulative. Yes. Effective. Also yes. At this point, Rome knew they weren't dealing with just another barbarian general. Hannibal was a tactician, a political manipulator, and somehow a master of Alpine logistics. He was like a Renaissance man just 1,700 years early. By now, word had spread across Italy like wildfire. A Carthaginian general had crossed the Alps with elephants and was now winning battle after battle on Roman soil. Panic spread to the Senate. The people of Rome were scared. Senators began arguing about whether they should defend the city or evacuate the countryside. But Hannibal, he didn't march on Rome, not yet. Instead, he began moving deeper into the Italian peninsula, looking for allies, gathering supplies, and waiting for the next opportunity to strike. And the Romans, still reeling from the Trebia, were about to walk into an even worse disaster. The year was 217 BCE, and Hannibal was on the move, slipping through Italy like a ghost in the night. After smashing Roman forces at the Trebia River, he needed to keep the pressure on. He turned south, marching through the swampy lowlands of Etruria, a decision that was, in a word, horrifying. Now, you'd think, after surviving an Alpine death march, Hannibal might go easy on his men. But nope. Into the fetid marshes they went, no roads, no rest, waist deep in stagnant water. The soldiers trudged forward for days, blinded by mist, plagued by mosquitoes, with no time to sleep. Some animals drowned, others were abandoned. A lot of sandals were lost forever to the mud. And here's your weird detail of the night. Hannibal himself is said to have lost vision in one eye during this swamp march. Yuppie basically got a swamp eye infection and just kept going like it was nothing. Imagine the motivational speeches. After that, you think you're tired. I can't even see out of one side of my head. Meanwhile, Rome had appointed a new consul, Gaius Flaminius, a man known for being brave but, let's say, rash. When he heard Hannibal was nearby, Flaminius ignored advice, ignored omens, which included some pretty disturbing animal sacrifices, and marched his army straight into a trap. This brings us to the Battle of Lake Trasimene, one of the most brilliant ambushes in military history and also one of the most embarrassing defeats Rome ever suffered. Hannibal had scouted a narrow valley beside the mist-covered lake. He hid thousands of soldiers in the surrounding hills, leaving only a small force visible on the road. Flaminius, thinking he'd caught Hannibal off guard, charged in without scouting ahead. Big mistake. The moment the Roman column entered the valley, Hannibal sprung the trap. Carthaginian troops crashed down from the hills, blocking the exits. The Roman army was caught in a foggy nightmare, attacked from all sides, with no visibility, no retreat, and nowhere to hide. Many Romans fled into the lake and drowned with their armor, dragging them down. It was a massacre. About 15,000 Roman soldiers died in a single morning, and Flaminius, he was killed early in the battle, allegedly thrown from his horse and speared. In the chaos, this was not a war anymore, it was a public humiliation. Rome was in crisis. Senators locked themselves in debate. Citizens feared Hannibal would now march straight to the capital. But instead of attacking Rome, he turned away again. Why? Maybe his army wasn't strong enough. Maybe he wanted more allies. Or maybe Just maybe he wanted to drag Rome into despair bit by bit. Now, let's talk about what Rome did next. In the face of total panic, they did something truly sensible. They appointed a dictator. Enter Quintus Fabius Maximus, a man who had no interest in flashy victories. His strategy: avoid open battle at all costs, burn the crops, block the roads, harass the enemy, and wait for Hannibal to wear himself out. This became known as the Fabian strategy, and it drove people mad. Romans were not fans of patience. They wanted blood and revenge, not crop sabotage. Senators mocked Fabius, calling him Conctator the Delayer. He took it as a compliment. But let's give the man some credit. His tactics worked. Hannibal couldn't get the open fight he wanted. Supplies ran thin, and his Italian allies weren't joining in the rebellion as quickly as he'd hoped. Still, Fabius made one small mistake. He left his subordinate Minucius in charge for a bit, and Minucius thought, you know what, let's fight, and promptly got ambushed by Hannibal. Fabius had to rescue him. Awkward now. Here's a strange detail for your dreams. Hannibal once tricked a Roman detachment at night by tying torches to the horns of cattle, sending them up a hill to look like an army marching. While the Romans scrambled to prepare for battle, Hannibal snuck through the pass unnoticed. That's right, he used flaming cows as a distraction. Tactical brilliance. Meet farm animals. But as the months dragged on, people got tired of Fabius' cautiousness. So, the next year, Rome went back to what it knew best, charging headfirst into disaster. 2 new consuls were elected. Both were aggressive, both wanted glory, and both were about to walk into the worst military defeat in Roman history. Hannibal had camped near a small town called Cannae, in the dusty plains of southern Italy. He was low on elephants, low on manpower, but not low on cunning. The Roman Senate, convinced this would be the final battle, sent nearly 80,000 soldiers, the largest army Rome had ever assembled. The plan was simple: crush Hannibal with sheer numbers. Spoiler alert, it did not go well. But that, dear listener, is a story for tomorrow night. The sun rose over the dry fields near a small village in southern Italy. It was August of 216 BCE, and the dust barely settled on the Roman boots stomping across the plains. Nearly 80,000 soldiers, twice the size of Hannibal's force, were arrayed for war. You'd think this was going to be a slam dunk for Rome. Spoiler, it really wasn. Single quotes T. Hello, welcome to the part where everything gets worse. After the cautious Fabius Maximus was set aside, the Roman Senate put its trust in 2 consuls, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. Now imagine putting a philosopher and a frat bro in charge of your nation's military strategy. That's kind of what happened here. Paulus was careful. Varro wanted to charge. And because Rome believed in alternating command, they took turns leading the army each day. Yes, that was a real system. What could go wrong? On Varro's day, he went all in. And Hannibal, with his smaller, mixed army of North Africans, Spaniards, Gauls, and surviving war elephants, well, maybe 1 or 2 elderly ones, prepared the ultimate trap. The Roman formation was straightforward: a massive block of infantry in the center, deep, dense, and determined, with cavalry on both wings. The goal: smash through the middle like a wrecking ball. Hannibal, on the other hand, arranged his forces in a crescent-shaped formation. The weaker troops, mostly Gauls, were in the center, slightly forward, with his veteran African soldiers tucked away on the flanks, ready to spring. And spring they did. As the Roman center pushed forward, it seemed like they were winning. The Carthaginian front lines fell back. The Romans pushed harder, but the crescent curved inward, like a trap tightening. The flanks began to close. Soon the Romans were surrounded on all sides, front, back, left, right, trapped in a tightening ring of steel and screaming. What happened next is known as one of the most perfect tactical victories in all of military history. Hannibal had orchestrated a double envelopment. He encircled a force twice his size and annihilated it. By the time the dust cleared, more than 50,000 Romans were dead. That's not a typo. 50,000 in one day. It was so horrifying that people later said the gods must have turned away their faces. The battlefield was littered with Roman shields, broken swords, trampled bodies, and a whole lot of consular pride. Paulus was dead. Varro fled. Some survivors hid beneath corpses and crawled away in the night. Others were captured and sold into slavery. One lucky Roman cavalryman, Scipio, managed to escape, and would go on to become someone very important later. But we'll save that for a future nap. Now, here's a strange and oddly tragic detail. The rings. Roman senators wore golden rings. After the battle, Hannibal allegedly collected bushels of them from the dead and sent them back to Carthage in bags as proof of victory. It was both a boast and a warning. Carthage put them on public display, like a really dark art exhibit. Back in Rome, panic didn't even begin to describe it. They banned public mourning, so the city wouldn't be buried in grief. They refused to ransom prisoners. They just froze. For a while, it felt like Rome itself might crumble. But Hannibal didn't march on Rome. Again, historians still debate why. Some say his army was exhausted. Some argue he expected Rome's allies to rise up in rebellion. Others believe he simply didn't have siege equipment hand. You can't batter down Rome's walls with hopes and elephants. Still, in the wake of Cannae, many Italian cities did rebel. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, joined Hannibal. Others followed. For a moment, it looked like the Carthaginian dream was coming true. So, what did Rome do? The only thing it could: dig in. They raised new armies. They called back Fabius, Maximus, and said, "Okay, fine, delay things again." They fortified every city. They blocked Hannibal at every pass. And they turned their attention to the long game. Meanwhile, Hannibal settled in southern Italy. For years, he held territory, fought skirmishes, made alliances, and waited. But the tide was slowly turning against him. Here's your weird trivia of the night. During these years, Hannibal reportedly used vinegar and fire to crack open rocks, blocking mountain paths. Was it effective engineering or ancient myth? Historians still argue about it, but it makes for a dramatic image: soldiers pouring vinegar and setting fire to boulders like chefs gone mad. As for Rome, they'd been bloodied, humbled, and battered, but they weren't broken. And in the background, a new hero was rising: young Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of a fallen general, survivor of Cannae, and future nightmare of Carthage. But before he'd cross swords with Hannibal, more strange detours were still to come, including battles in Spain, political blunders in Syracuse, and one very peculiar inventor with a thing for mirrors. We'll get there tomorrow night. The war between Rome and Carthage was no longer confined to the Italian countryside. After the disaster at Cannae, Rome refused to surrender, instead began to spread its arms wider, looking to cut Hannibal off from his lifeline. Spain. Let's take a quick hop across the Mediterranean, to a place where olives grew fat, war horses galloped across dry plains, and every family reunion ended in a military campaign. Welcome to the land of the Scipios. In Spain, Carthage had set up a strong base, filled with silver mines, seasoned soldiers, and Hannibal's little brother, Hasdrubal Barca. Yes, another Barca. You didn't think Hannibal was a solo act, did you? Hasdrubal wasn't quite the tactical magician his older brother was, but he was a competent commander, and he held the territory together, while Hannibal was off turning Italy into a living nightmare. Rome knew they had to split the pressure. If they could shake Spain, Hannibal would feel it. So, they sent not one, but two: Scipios Cnaeus and Publius, the father and uncle of our young rising star. These two brothers led campaigns up and down the Iberian Peninsula, capturing cities, forging alliances, and dodging ambushes like they were in some ancient version of a buddy cop movie. And just like any good action movie, it didn't last. In 211 BCE, the Scipio brothers launched a bold offensive, splitting their forces to take on multiple Carthaginian armies at once. You can already sense where this is going, right? They were overwhelmed. One brother was betrayed by his Iberian allies. The other was surrounded and killed in a fierce engagement. It was a double blow. Rome lost both commanders within weeks. Spain looked like it might fall completely back into Carthaginian hands. But here's where things start to twist again. Instead of falling apart, Rome sent a fresh commander to take up the family torch. A 25-year-old man with ambition, charisma, and possibly the best haircut in Republican history: Publius Cornelius Scipio. Yes, that's Scipio. He arrived in Spain and quickly did something no one expected. He took the fight directly to the Carthaginians' throat, using clever strategy, bold deception, and some frankly impressive confidence for a man barely old enough to rent a chariot. Scipio led a lightning assault on New Carthage, the Carthaginian capital in Spain. The city fell in a stunning display of speed and precision. Rome now had a crucial base in Iberia, and Hannibal had a very real problem. And now for a bizarre detour. In the middle of this campaign, Scipio was said to have returned a captured noblewoman to her fiancé unharmed, gaining the loyalty of several Spanish tribes. Was it gallantry or just savvy politics? Historians still debate whether it was chivalry or RPR. Back in Italy, Hannibal's fortunes were stuck in neutral. His Italian allies were wavering. Rome's armies were bigger and better trained. His brother Hasdrubal now needed to bring reinforcements by land, and this meant crossing the Alps. Yes, again. Apparently, one family just could not resist a good Alpine adventure. In 207 BCE, Hasdrubal did what his brother had done over a decade earlier. He gathered his army and elephants, what remained of them, marched across the Pyrenees, through Gaul, and aimed to unite with Hannibal in central Italy. If the two Barcas joined forces, Rome could fall. But this time, Rome had learned. Their armies intercepted Hasdrubal at the Battle of the Meteris River. It was a brutal fight. Hasdrubal fought hard, but in the end, his army was destroyed and he was killed. Legend says his head was sent south and thrown into Hannibal's camp as a grotesque message. "You're alone now." Ouch! The loss crushed Hannibal's hopes of reinforcement. He remained a ghost in the hills of southern Italy, still feared, still dangerous, but no longer unbeatable. Here's your odd trivia for the night. During this period, Roman citizens would dedicate tiny wax models of body parts at temples, hoping for healing. A sore leg, wax leg; toothache, wax teeth. It's like ancient healthcare, but without the co-pay. Anyway, while Hannibal hung on in Italy like a shadow, Scipio was cleaning house in Spain. One by one, he defeated Carthaginian armies, forged alliances with native tribes, and turned the tide. By 206 BCE, Carthage had been pushed out of Iberia completely. The young Scipio had done the impossible. He had turned Spain from a Carthaginian, a stronghold, into a Roman launchpad, and now he had bigger plans. He would take the fight to Africa. Rome wasn't just going to defend anymore. It was time to strike at Carthage's heart and draw Hannibal home. But before that showdown, there would be politics, betrayals, and one deeply misunderstood genius involving mirrors, pulleys, and flaming death rays. That's coming up tomorrow. With Spain cleared of Carthaginian forces, Scipio returned to Rome not just as a hero but as a prodigy. At barely 30 years old, he walked into the Senate with a bold proposal: take the war to Africa, to Carthage itself. Now, if you think that Roman Senate was a place of visionary leadership, just remember, these were the same men who nearly ignored Hannibal until elephants started showing up in their vineyards. So of course, the Senate wasn't exactly thrilled about sending a young general, untested in politics, across the sea to poke the Carthaginian lion in the eye. Still, public support for Scipio was massive. He was charming, handsome, and had just avenged his father and uncle. The people adored him. One senator reportedly grumbled that Scipio had bewitched the crowd, which, in politics, is basically a compliment. Eventually, the Senate approved his command, albeit with limited resources. Rome would give him a handful of legions, and Scipio would have to raise the rest himself. No pressure. So Scipio did what any ambitious general would do. He charmed, bargained, and promised glory to anyone who'd listen. Soldiers flocked to him, allies offered supplies, and in 204 BCE, his fleet set sail across the blue Mediterranean, bound for North Africa. Now, here's a weird footnote for your pillow tonight. Carthaginian sailors believed in a sea god, who punished sailors for spitting into the wind. Ancient superstition, or just really good sailing advice? You decide. Landing in Africa was no small feat. Scipio immediately began securing alliances with local Numidian kings. One of them, Massinissa, was a wildcard, a brilliant cavalry commander, who had switched sides more than once. Massinissa finally joined Rome for good. His horsemen would prove invaluable. Meanwhile, Carthage scrambled. They recalled their best general from Italicus. Hannibal was finally coming home. But before he could arrive, Scipio went full genius mode. He launched a surprise night attack on the Carthaginian camp at the Battle of the Great Plains. Fires lit the sky. Roman soldiers swarmed through the enemy lines. The Carthaginian army was crushed, and the Numidian prince, Seafox, a key Carthaginian ally, was captured. Imagine being Seafox captured in your pajamas, possibly still holding a cup of goat's milk. By now, Carthage was desperate. Hannibal landed back on home soil, welcomed as a national savior, But even he knew the situation was grim. He had fewer troops, fewer allies, and a city that had forgotten how to fight on its own soil. The two greatest commanders of the age were about to meet, and, for one brief moment, they met, not in battle, but in person. Hannibal and Scipio reportedly held a private meeting, a parley. No witnesses, no record of the conversation. Did they negotiate peace? Did they try to outwit each other? Did they just sit awkwardly in silence, sipping ancient wine and avoiding eye contact? Historians still debate whether this meeting ever happened, or if it was just poetic storytelling. Either way, peace didn't follow. Now, here's your off-topic detail. Ancient Carthaginians used ground-crushed snails to make purple dye. Royal purple wasn't just a color, it was a commitment. 1 pound of dye could take thousands of snails. Somewhere, there's a sea deity very upset about this. Back on the battlefield, Hannibal prepared his last stand near the town of Zama. He still had war elephants, hardened veterans, and the sharpest tactical mind of his generation. Scipio had his own veterans, fresh African allies, and an army that idolized him. Zama would be a final gamble. Winner takes all. And just before the battle began, something eerie happened. Hannibal looked across the field, not at the terrain, not at his cavalry, but at Scipio himself. It was like watching an old lion eyeing a younger, stronger challenger. There was no turning back. The fate of two empires would be decided by one battlefield. Tomorrow night, we'll stand in the dust of Zama and find out which genius blinked first. But before you go, here's a little joke to help you sleep. What did the Roman soldier say after his third glass of wine? Where'd I put my gladius? Good night. The sun rose over the dusty plains near Zama, casting long shadows across the waiting armies. On one side stood Hannibal, his reputation immense, his war elephants restless. On the other, Scipio, the rising Roman star, calm and composed. This was at the moment two military titans would collide in a battle that would shape history. Hannibal's forces included 80 war elephants, several thousand infantry, and what remained of his cavalry, though his best horsemen had stayed behind. In Italy, his army was a patchwork. Some were grizzled veterans from Italy, others raw recruits from Carthage and surrounding regions. It was not the army he had once led through the Alps. Across the field, Scipio had fewer men, but his troops were disciplined and confident. He had Numidian cavalry under Massinissifast, ruthless riders who knew this terrain better than anyone, and his Roman infantry was battle-hardened from years of war in Spain and Africa. Both sides knew the stakes. This was no skirmish. This was for the future of the Mediterranean world. As the elephants charged, first thunderous, terrifying beasts thundering toward the Roman line, Scipio revealed his first trick. He had trained his men to open corridors between the maniples. Instead of panicking, the Romans simply stepped aside. The elephants barreled harmlessly through the gaps, some of them turning around in confusion, others stampeding into Hannibal's own front lines. That's got a stink. Defeated by your own elephants. With the beasts neutralized, Scipio ordered his infantry forward. The two armies slammed into each other, steel against steel, shield against spear. The battle raged for hours in a brutal, grinding clash. Roman and Carthaginian soldiers pushed, fought, and died for every inch of ground. And here comes the weird, historical moment for your night. During the chaos of Zama, a Carthaginian officer reportedly bit a Roman centurion's ear in a close-quarters struggle. Yes, a full-on Mike Tyson moment in 202 BCE. But back to the real turning point. Hannibal's final line. His veteran Italian campaigners held firm. These were the men who had marched with him for over a decade. From the Alps to the gates of Rome. They were exhausted, yes, but also deeply loyal. And they began to push the Romans back. That's when Scipio made his move. With perfect timing, he signaled Massinissa's cavalry and his Roman horsemen, who had vanished earlier, into the flanks. They swooped back onto the battlefield, slamming into Hannibal's rear line. The Carthaginians were trapped, squeezed from front and back, like olives under a Roman press. Panic spread. Formation broke. Hannibal's army collapsed. Victory belonged to Rome. The battlefield was littered with shields, broken spears, and the lifeless forms of men and elephants alike. Hannibal, still alive, retreated. The unthinkable had happened. He had been defeated. Now, let's take a moment for an oddity. After the battle, Scipio and Hannibal reportedly spoke again. This time, face to face. Hannibal allegedly told Scipio, of all those who have ever led armies, you are the greatest." If true, it was a warrior's farewell, full of grudging admiration. But whether he actually said it, historians still debate whether that final meeting was fact, fiction, or just a poetic flourish in Livy's notes. Carthage sued for peace. The terms were brutal: massive indemnities, the surrender of its fleet, and a promise never to raise arms without Rome's permission. Carthage would live, but it would never again challenge Rome's dominance. And here's your quirky bedtime detail. As part of the peace treaty, Carthage had to hand over its war elephants, but the Romans had no idea what to do with dozens of anxious, combat-trained elephants, so they reportedly let them wander around, gently escorted, of course, through southern Italy for years. Imagine a Roman farmer waking up to find an elephant eating his olive trees. Scipio returned to Rome. A hero. For his victory, he was given a new title, Scipio Africanus. Not a bad nickname, honestly. Beats Scipio the Elephant Whisperer. As for Hannibal, he faded from the Roman spotlight, but remained a thorn in their side. He would go on to advise enemy kings, spark rebellions, and dodge Roman assassins for years. But that's a tale for another night. But for now, let's end on one last laugh. What did the Numidian cavalryman say to his slow horse? "Your lucky elephants don't do performance reviews. Sleep tight." Carthage had been spared total destruction, but at a steep price. The peace after Zama felt less like relief and more like humiliation, slow, crushing submission to Roman power. The once proud city now operated under the shadow of its conqueror. Like a noble beast yoked to a plough, Scipio Africanus returned to Rome in triumph. There were parades, garlands, gold, and glory. He was hailed as the man who had saved the Republic. Statues were raised. Streets were renamed. He was offered all sorts of honors, including the chance to be a dictator, but declined, preferring instead to enjoy his retirement as a living legend. Meanwhile, in Carthage, Hannibal did the unthinkable. He ran for office, and won. Elected as Suffete, the highest civic post in Carthage, Hannibal launched a bold internal reform campaign. He cracked down on corruption, streamlined the tax system, and exposed shady deals that the old aristocrats had long profited from. You can imagine the city's elite whispering behind his back, he should have stayed in the Alps. But Hannibal wasn't done yet. Even as a statesman, he remained a soldier at heart, and Rome noticed. His popularity, both in Carthage and abroad, made Roman senators nervous. The same man who had nearly brought Rome to its knees was now winning battles with spreadsheets. So, Rome sent a polite message. "Hey, Carthage, love what you're doing with your city, but could you, get rid of Hannibal?" And Carthage, cowed and compliant, agreed. So Hannibal fled, first to Tyre, then to the court of Antiochus III in the Seleucid Empire, Rome's rising rival in the east. There, Hannibal became a military advisor, whispering strategies and stoking fires against his old enemies. He was still fighting Rome, just through proxies. Here's your strange little detail for tonight. Hannibal supposedly carried a poison ring at all times. A tiny hidden compartment filled with venom tucked inside a gem, just in case Rome ever got too close. Meanwhile, Rome kept growing slowly but inevitably, swallowing more territory across the Mediterranean. It was like a sea tide lapping away at every coast. Quiet at first, but impossible to stop. Back in Italy, Scipio wasn't having the glorious retirement he might have hoped for. Political enemies began to surface, accusing him of corruption and financial mismanagement during his time in Spain and Africa. It was a bitter irony. The man who saved Rome now found himself defending his honor in front of senators who had never even seen a battlefield. Still, Scipio refused to grovel. In one famous outburst, he pointed to his war trophies and shouted, "You accuse me here, but the spoils of Carthage stand as my defense." Then he stormed out of the chamber, never to return. Like Hannibal, Scipio ended his days in exile, a voluntary one. He moved to the countryside, near Liternum, far from the bickering of Rome. His health declined, and his legend faded into memory. They say he asked to be buried with a humble inscription, "Ungrateful fatherland, you shall not even have my bones." That's one way to ghost your homeland. Across the sea, Hannibal was still on the move. When Antiochus went to war with Rome, Hannibal joined him, but the campaign fizzled. The Seleucid army was no match for Roman organization and discipline. When Antiochus lost, Hannibal fled once more, this time to Bithynia, a small kingdom clinging to the edge of independence. There, Rome caught up with him. They sent a delegation demanding his arrest, and the king, nervous about hosting such a famous fugitive, was ready to give in. But Hannibal saw the trap closing and made one final choice. According to ancient sources, he slipped away into a private chamber, crushed the poison capsule in his ring, and drank the venom. His last reported words, something along the lines of, "Let us relieve the Romans of their fear of a feeble old man." Was it poetic license? Maybe. Historians still debate whether the poison ring was real or just a dramatic story that grew larger with each telling. Either way, the great general was gone, so now we had two legends, both fallen: Scipio, the conqueror without a country, and Hannibal, the warrior without a war. And yet, their shadows lingered. The memory of Hannibal haunted Rome for centuries. Mothers warned their children, "If you don't behave, Hannibal will come." The phrase "Hannibal at the gates" became a metaphor for terror, and Scipio's strategies were studied by every aspiring Roman commander from that point forward. Tonight's odd anecdote: long after their deaths, coins in Spain were found with images of both Hannibal and Scipio, side by side. Imagine your childhood rival, sharing your commemorative lunchbox. Their rivalry had become myth. Their war fought across mountains, rivers, and generations was more than a struggle between cities. It was a collision of empires, of strategies, of wills, and in many ways, both men lost something they never got back: the thrill of the fight, and the world they had once tried to conquer. But you just get to enjoy the tale from a cozy bed. And here's one last laugh for the road. What do you call an elephant who never forgets a grudge? A Hannibalphant. Good night, General. Rest those weary eyes. The world moved on, as it always does, leaving behind even its greatest heroes and its bloodiest battles. Carthage, though defeated, still stood, but it stood under the strict and watchful eye of Rome. No army, no warships, no foreign policy, just trade-on to taxes. And if you think the Romans were satisfied with that, oh no, Rome doesn't do half victories. It had become an empire, not just of swords, but of grudges. And the grudge against Carthage, it was personal. Over in the Roman Senate, a man named Cato the Elder had made it his life's mission to fan the embers of hate. He would end every speech, no matter the topic, with the same chilling phrase: "Carthago delendis." Carthage must be destroyed. You could have been talking about grain prices or plumbing issues in Pompeii, and Cato would have popped up like, yes, but also Carthage must be destroyed. And in Carthage, people tried to move on. Commerce returned. The harbor buzzed again. Farmers replanted their vineyards. Children laughed in the streets, but the fear never quite left. The terms of peace were so suffocating that the city couldn't grow or breathe. Worse still, Carthage wasn't even allowed to defend itself. So when the neighboring Numidian king Massinissa, remember him, started poking at the borders and seizing land, Carthage protested to Rome. Rome shrugged. "You want to fight? That's adorable. You're not allowed to have soldiers, remember." So, what did Carthage do? It broke the treaty. Out of sheer desperation, it raised a small army to protect itself from Massinissa's incursions. And Rome, grinning like a fox, saw its chance. The Senate declared, "You violated the peace." And that was that. The Third Punic War had begun, not because Carthage was a threat, but because Rome wanted an excuse. Here's your oddball historical footnote. The Roman envoy sent to Carthage during the crisis was reportedly so impressed by the city's beauty that he begged the Senate to spare it. His name was Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus. Poetic, right? But the Senate had no patience for poetry. The Roman legions returned to Africa not as liberators, but as executioners. They landed in 149 BCE with a terrifying ultimatum: surrender all weapons, dismantle your walls, move your entire population inland at least 10 miles from the coast. Carthage's response, a trembling but defiant no. This time, Carthage chose to die standing. The city prepared for siege. They fortified what they could. Every able man, woman and child worked around the clock, melting down metal, building weapons, storing food. Even their temples were stripped of brass to make arrowheads. In one case, hair from noblewomen was woven into rope for catapults. Let's pause and appreciate the sheer commitment of a city ready to go down with style. And Rome, too, prepared for total annihilation. But here's where it gets intense. Carthage didn't fall easily for nearly 3 years. The defenders held out, house by house, street by street. It was brutal urban warfare. Fires raged, arrows flew, food ran out, and still, the Carthaginians fought. Scipio Emilianus, that same general who had tried to spare the city, was given command of the siege. Reluctantly, he ordered the final assault. His legions breached the walls, entered the city, and began one of the most methodical destructions in ancient history. The Carthaginians took their final stand in the Byrsa, the citadel atop the city. Families barricaded themselves in buildings, choosing to burn rather than surrender. According to some ancient accounts, the flames rose so high they could be seen from miles away, like a beacon of despair. Here's your creepy curiosity of the night. It's said that the Roman soldiers found human bones in the ashes of Carthaginian religious altars, fueling old rumors of child sacrifice. Whether this was true or a Roman smear campaign, historians still debate that one. And when it was over, Rome did what Rome does best. They leveled Carthage, razed it to the ground. They enslaved every survivor, and according to some later accounts they salted the earth so that nothing would grow again, though that part might be apocryphal, more poetic revenge fantasy than verified fact. Still, the message was loud and clear: never rise against Rome. Scipio Emilianus reportedly wept as he watched the city burn. When asked why, he quoted a line from Homer: "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish." He realized that all empires, no matter how mighty, would one day fall, including Rome. Let's pause for a joke so you don't go to sleep dreaming of fire and doom. Why did the Carthaginian cross the Alps? To find someone who hadn't heard of Hannibal yet. Okay, too soon. The Punic Wars were over. Rome was now the uncontested ruler of the Mediterranean. Its path to global domination lay open, but it had come at a terrible cost, not just in blood and treasure, but in soul. Rome had become the very monster it once feared. Still, in dark corners of the empire, stories were whispered of Hannibal's elephants, of Scipio's brilliance, of a city that refused to bow. Carthage was gone, but its legend remained, and tonight you get to carry that legend into your dreams. Rome had won, but peace, that was still a mirage shimmering on the horizon. With Carthage erased from the map, Rome turned its gaze elsewhere. The Punic Wars had unlocked a hunger that couldn't be undone, like a teenager who just won their first wrestling match and now thinks they can take on the Olympics. Rome decided it was ready for global domination. But before Rome could do that, it had to deal with an annoying little detail: the people who helped it win. Remember the Numidian king who teamed up with Rome, the guy who poked Carthage like a kid poking a sleeping bear? Well, his descendants, now ruling a bigger and richer Numidia, were starting to get bold enough that even Rome started feeling uneasy. And then there were the Spanish provinces. Spain conquered partially during the Second Punic War, but never really pacified. The locals, especially the Lusitanians and Celtiberians, had this stubborn habit of rebelling every time a Roman turned around. One man would rise from these rebel tribes to become the Romans' worst Iberian nightmare. Viriathus, the shepherd, a former warrior turned bandit, turned tactical genius. He led guerrilla campaigns that made even hardened Roman commanders weep into their togas. It's like trying to catch smoke with a net. Rome, of course, dealt with him the way they dealt with most problems: bribes, betrayal, and a well-timed dagger. Viriathus was assassinated in his sleep by his own supposed allies, who were then told by the Romans, "Rome does not pay traitors." Cold, but also kind of on brand. Meanwhile, back in Italy, trouble was brewing in the streets, not with swords, but with spoons. Yes, spoons. Because Rome's internal problem wasn't war, it was wealth. After the Punic Wars, Rome had grown richer than it knew how to handle. The elite hoarded land, built lavish villas, and imported luxuries from across the Mediterranean. Think gold furniture, Greek slaves who doubled as poets, and wine that cost more than a horse. And the poor, well, they were left with bread and sometimes not even that. In came the Gracchi brothers, Tiberius and Gaius, noble-born idealists who tried to fix the system. Land reform, food distribution, citizenship rights, you name it, they championed it. But Rome didn't like reformers. Not then, not ever. Both brothers were murdered by mobs of senators and their thugs on the very steps of the Roman Forum, because nothing says healthy democracy like clubbing a political rival with a table leg. And yet, the Gracchi started something they never lived to see. the slow, painful collapse of the Roman Republic. You see, Rome's enemies weren't just foreign, they were internal. Ambition, greed, fear. Those were the real assassins. Here's your strange historical moment for this part. Around this time, Rome passed a law banning purple clothing for anyone not of senatorial rank. Why? Because the dye was expensive, and apparently, nothing threatened Rome's sense of order like civilians dressing fancy. Imagine being arrested for wearing a snazzy outfit. Fashion crime. Ancient edition. But let's shift the lens to the east, where Rome's next major showdown was taking shape. Enter the Seleucid Empire, one of Alexander the Great's old territorial leftovers, now ruled by a dramatic fellow named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus had big ideas. He wanted to revive Greek dominance and expand westward, starting with Egypt. Problem: Rome wasn't having it. In what might be the pettiest diplomatic moment in ancient history, a Roman envoy, Gaius Popilius Laenas, met Antiochus on his march toward Alexandria. He drew a circle in the sand around the king and said, "You will not cross this circle until you give Rome an answer." Talk about drawing a line in the sand. Literally, Antiochus blinked. He backed off. And just like that, Rome had cowed a king without lifting a sword. You have to admire the audacity. It's like telling someone they're not allowed to enter your party while standing on their welcome mat. But with every victory, Rome became more arrogant, more bloated, more unstable. Slavery skyrocketed. Entire villages across the Mediterranean were depopulated to fuel Rome's need for labor. And this wasn't just bad for the slaves, it was bad for free Roman farmers, who now couldn't compete with mass-scale slave-run estates. The Roman countryside began to empty. Poor citizens flooded into the city, hoping for work but finding none. Crime rose. Corruption festered. Bread and circuses became the go-to distraction tactic. Let's slip in a joke so your dreams don't involve ancient class warfare. Why did the Roman farmer quit his job? Because every time he tried to grow something, a senator bought the land and turned it into a vineyard for pet ostriches. Yes. Pet ostriches were a thing. Don't ask. And all of this, the unrest, the inequality, the betrayals, was starting to point to one outcome: civil war. But we're not quite there yet. First, Rome had a few more empires to crush, and a few more battles to win, just to make sure the history books stayed spicy. Still, the seeds of collapse had been planted, and they were being watered with gold, blood, and just a little bit of that purple dye no one was supposed to wear. Rome may have dominated the western Mediterranean, but the east, that was where the real jewels weren't. Rome, now fully intoxicated by conquest, began eyeing the ancient kingdoms of Greece, Macedonia, and beyond like a child in a candy store, with no adult supervision. Let's begin with Macedonia, home to Alexander the Great. Remember him? Well, after his death, his empire shattered like a dropped vase, and Macedonia became just another faded kingdom. But they still had pride, and horses, and an unshakable belief that they could take on Rome. Spoiler: they couldn't. The Macedonian Wars were a series of increasingly one-sided affairs. In one of them, Rome squared off against Perseus of Macedon, not the hero who fought Medusa. Different guy, less snakes. He tried diplomacy, alliances, even clever ambushes. But Rome responded with something much scarier: efficient bureaucracy and relentless military formations. The final battle at Pydna in 168 BCE wasn't even close. Roman legions steamrolled the phalanx. After the dust settled, Macedonia was carved up and absorbed into the Republic. Another crown jewel for Rome's trophy shelf. What did they do with Perseus? They paraded him through the streets of Rome in chains during a triumph while Romans pelted him with garbage and insults. Then he was locked in a dungeon to die. Rome had this habit of mixing performance art with cruelty. Meanwhile, over in Greece, things were unraveling faster than a badly tied toga. The Greeks, philosophical and proud, didn't exactly love Roman boots on their marble streets, so the city of Corinth rebelled. Big mistake. In 146 BCE, Rome flattened Corinth. I mean, scorched earth. Statues melted, citizens enslaved, kind of flattened. That same year, across the sea, Carthage met its final end. Same year, 2 destroyed cities. That's efficiency. Or overcompensation. Strange moment. After destruction, Roman soldiers reportedly melted down Greek bronze statues and mixed them with gold. creating a weird alloy that supposedly cursed any who wore it. Bad fashion and bad luck double whammy. So with Greece under Roman sandals and Macedonia turned into a Roman province, you'd think the senators back home would be celebrating. Nope, they were panicking. You see, all these conquests brought in too much money and too many slaves, which sounds like a rich person's problem, but in Rome, it meant chaos. The elite built massive estates, worked by thousands of enslaved people, while poor Roman citizens couldn't find jobs, or bread, or wine that didn't taste like vinegar. In walked a Roman general with a new idea. Give the army to the people. Enter Gaius Marius, the man who broke all the rules. Marius reformed the army, allowing landless citizens to join. In return, they got land after service. It was genius, it was popular, and it shattered the old republican system where only landowners could fight. Now soldiers didn't fight for Rome, they fought for their general. You see where this is going. Marius became a hero of the common people. He won wars, especially against invading Germanic tribes like the Cimbri and Teutones. Fun fact, the Romans were so terrified of the Cimbri, they once had a national day of panic. Officially, but Marius also made enemies, particularly with a man who'd one day march on Rome itself. Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Yes, Sulla, ambitious, vain, absolutely not a team player. Their rivalry turned into the First Roman Civil War. Legions fought legions. Rome, for the first time, saw Roman blood spilled on Roman soil not by outsiders, but by its own sons. At one point, Sulla even marched into Rome with his army, which, until then, was considered the ultimate taboo, like bringing an elephant to a dinner party. Speaking of elephants, remember how Hannibal brought them through the Alps? Well, turns out Sulla rode in a chariot pulled by white horses when he returned from campaign, just to show he was divinely favored. Subtle, right? Sulla won, and to celebrate, he made a list, not a grocery list, a death list. The prescriptions were public hit lists of people Sulla wanted gone. He put their names on boards in the forum, offered rewards for their heads, and let anyone claim their property. It was like a very bloody raffle, with worse odds. Thousands died. But the Republic limped on, though more like a zombie than a functioning state. Let's lighten the mood before bed. Why did the Roman chicken join the army? Because it heard they gave land to excellent soldiers. You're welcome. As for Sulla, he retired, voluntarily, after turning Rome into a dictatorship. He just stepped down, went home, grew his beard, laughed at statues, died in bed. Historians still debate whether he did it out of regret or boredom. So where were we? Ah yes, Rome, drenched in blood, stuffing its vaults with gold, and losing grip on its values. The idea of a republic, governed by citizen senators, was turning into a dangerous joke. The poor were angry. The rich were paranoid. Generals now held the true power. The Senate, mostly yelling and plotting and accusing people of treason. Honestly, you'd be better off asking a tavern dog for policy advice. But something or someone was on the horizon. A man whose name would reshape Rome forever. Not yet, though. The storm hasn't broken. The Republic still breathes. Barely. When things fall apart slowly, they feel inevitable. But when they collapse all at once, it feels like history is having a nervous breakdown. Rome, at this point, wasn't just creaking, it was cracking. Enter 3 men, 1 secret deal, and the beginning of the end for the Republic. Let's meet the first triumvirate. Sounds official, right? It wasn't. No paperwork, no Senate approval, just 3 ambitious powerhouses deciding, let's run the show. First, Gaius Julius Caesar, charming, deeply in debt, and with more ambition than hair. A master manipulator, who could sway a crowd like a seasoned politician, and he was one. Also fond of referring to himself in the third person, which Second, Pompey the Great, military genius, beloved by his troops, and once married to Caesar's daughter Julia. Think of him as the Roman version of a retired sports hero, except with legions instead of trophies. Third, Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, like owns the fire brigade, and charges you to put out your burning house. Kind of rich. He once melted down a golden crown just to see how much it weighed. Subtle. Together, these 3 controlled politics, appointments, and military might. Caesar took Gaul, Pompey stayed close to Rome, and Crassus went east to fight the Parthians, chasing dreams of glory. And then it happened. Crassus, the man who thought money could buy anything, including victory, got his legions handed to him. In the desert at Carrhae, killed. His head was supposedly used in a Parthian play. Dramatic and deeply inappropriate. With Crassus gone, balance shattered. Caesar and Pompey were no longer allies. They were two alphas with one bone, the control of Rome, while Caesar was off in Gaul writing the Gallic Wars, a bestseller. By the way, he really did write it himself. He conquered tribes, built bridges, and even invaded Britain just to say he did. He was basically collecting achievements like it was a video game. He also made a strange boast that he could name every one of his soldiers. No one believed him, but the loyalty of his men, unquestionable. Back in Rome, the Senate by Pompey ordered Caesar to return, alone, without his army. Caesar's response: he crossed the Rubicon in 49 BCE. That phrase, crossing the Rubicon, it comes from this moment. It meant no turning back. The second he did it, he declared civil war. You'd think Rome would put up more of a fight, but Caesar swept through Italy like a storm. Pompey fled to Greece, regrouped, and readied for a showdown. They met in Pharsalus, and it wasn't even close. Despite being outnumbered, Caesar crushed Pompey's forces. Pompey fled again, this time to Egypt. Now, here's where history takes a detour into soap opera territory. Pompey thought Egypt would protect him. Instead, Ptolemy XIII had him beheaded on the beach as a welcome gift for Caesar. Not exactly the olive branch Pompey was expecting. When Caesar arrived and was handed his old rival's head, even he was horrified. He reportedly wept. Whether it was for his old friend, for Rome, or just for dramatic effect, historians still debate. Then came Cleopatra. Yes, that Cleopatra. Young, brilliant, politically savvy. She needed Caesar's support in a dynastic squabble with her brother-husband. Ancient Egypt, never boring. So, legend has it, she had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters inside a rolled-up carpet. Bold move. It worked. Caesar stayed in Egypt longer than anyone expected. 9 months. Coincidence? They had a stint Caesarian, though Rome would never officially recognize him. Cleopatra did everything to stake his claim. Back in Rome, Caesar was declared dictator for life. He wore purple, sat on a golden throne, and had coins minted with his face. The Senate began to whisper, then yell, then stab. On the Ides of March 44 BCE, a group of senators led by Brutus and Cassius surrounded Caesar at the theater of Pompey and stabbed him 23 times. They thought they were saving the Republic. Instead, they unleashed chaos. Strange side note, Caesar's physician claimed only one wound was fatal, and it wasn't the final one. In fact, many believe Caesar saw Brutus among the assassins and reportedly said, "Et Brute," but that might just be Shakespeare doing his thing again. The Senate hoped Rome would return to normal, but the people didn't cheer. They mourned. They loved Caesar. The man had fed them, entertained them, given them land, and now he was gone. Into the vacuum stepped Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man, charismatic and cunning. At Caesar's funeral, he read the will aloud, revealing generous gifts to the people and naming an heir, Gaius Octavius, Caesar's teenage grandnephew, practically unknown. But with that one act, he became Octavian, adopted son and political heir. The two Antony and Octavian joined forces with Lepidus to form the Second Triumvirate. Yes, another one. And what did they do? Issued another round of proscriptions, even more brutal than Sulla's. Thousands died. Cicero, the great orator, was among them, executed for criticizing Antony. His severed head was nailed to the rostrum. In the Forum, that's one way to silence a critic. The Republic, it was now a corpse with a name tag. Octavian and Antony split the empire. Antony took the east, Octavian the west. Antony went back to Egypt, back to Cleopatra. Their love story became legend. Twin children, lavish feasts, royal theatrics. But Octavian, cold and calculating, painted them as traitors. Rome was told, "Antony's gone native. Cleopatra's seducing our general. Our future is in danger." Cue the Battle of Actium, 31 BCE, naval warfare, betrayal, Cleopatra's fleet retreating, Antony following her and his men. Octavian emerged victorious. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Alexandria, surrounded, defeated. They both chose death over humiliation. Cleopatra's end, supposedly by asper bitter snake, smuggled in a basket of figs. but some say poison, or even murder. Historians still debate. Octavian returned to Rome alone, no rivals, no triumvirate, just him. And in 27 BCE, the Senate gave him a new name, Augustus. He didn't declare himself emperor, but he might as well have. The Republic was dead. The empire had begun, and the boy who once had nothing but a name now ruled the known world. Rome had changed, not overnight. Of course it never does. But with Augustus at the helm, the old republic was a memory wrapped in golden laurel leaves, and while he wore the mask of tradition, everyone knew the emperor had no equals. Still, Augustus was smart. He didn't call himself a king. Oh no, Rome hated kings. He called himself princeps, first citizen. Sounds modest, right? Like someone who stands in line and eats soup with the commoners. In reality, it meant total control. He ruled with a velvet glove but under it, an iron fist. Under Augustus, Rome entered its most stable period yet. The Pax Romana, or Roman, peace. Roads were paved, aqueducts flowed, the legions kept the borders safe, and merchants grew fat on trade. But Augustus also kept things tight, very tight. He banned adultery, awkward, considering his own family drama, regulated clothing, and made marriage mandatory for upper-class men. Yes, the emperor was now your wingman. He even created a special police force for fire and order. You'd think it was overkill, until you remember that Rome was basically made of wood and ambition. And then came the oddities. In an attempt to revive ancient Roman morals, Augustus reopened temples that hadn't seen a sacrifice in 100 years. He paraded around wearing simple wool clothes, claiming he was just a citizen. Meanwhile, his face was stamped on every coin in the empire. That's like saying, "I'm just one of you," while also naming a month after yourself. Yes, August is named after him. Caesar got July. Bit of a family tradition. Still, Augustus had a problem. He needed an heir. Tragedy after tragedy struck his family. His nephew died. His grandsons died. His stepson Drusus also died. It's like the world was trying to dodge becoming emperor. Eventually, only Tiberius remained. A moody, brooding man with the personality of a damp toga, but reliable. So Augustus adopted him and prepared Rome for a smooth transition. Augustus died in 14 CE, peacefully, in bed, surrounded by loved ones. That alone made him exceptional. He had ruled for over 40 years, and Rome, it mourned. Statues, parades, poems. He was deified, officially made a god. Imagine being your own religion. That's Augustus for you. Tiberius, now emperor, was not Augustus. He didn't charm. He brooded a lot, and he soon grew tired of the Senate, the people, the whole capital-city-vibe. So he moved to Capri, an island paradise where he ruled from afar, like a reclusive billionaire with really good Wi-Fi. Except, instead of tweets, he sent terrifying orders back to Rome. Enter Sejanus, his right-hand man and head of the Praetorian Guard, Rome's elite bodyguards. Sejanus was cunning and power-hungry. He began a quiet purge of the nobility, executing rivals and pretending it was all in the emperor's name. For a while, it worked, but Tiberius eventually caught wind, and Sejanus executed, brutally, with his statue pulled down and his memory scrubbed clean. Meanwhile, things in the imperial family got weirder. After Tiberius came Caligula, his grandnephew. At first, people cheered. Caligula had been raised by soldiers, knew the people, and seemed charming. For a few glorious months, it looked like Rome had a golden boy, and then he snapped. Maybe it was illness, maybe it was power, maybe it was just being named Little Boots by his legion as a child, which is what Caligula means. But within a year, he was declaring himself a living god, having conversations with the moon, and famously trying to appoint his horse as consul. Yes, his horse, granted. The horse had great hair and probably made better decisions than the Senate. But still, he drained the treasury with public games, confiscated fortunes, and turned the palace into a stage for his madness. Senators trembled. Citizens whispered. The Praetorian Guard, once again, decided enough was enough. They stabbed him in a hallway in 41 CE. No drama, no fanfare. Then came Claudius, found hiding behind a curtain. Literally, he had a limp and a stammer, and no one took him seriously, which made him perfect. The guard declared him emperor on the spot, and surprise he turned out to be. competent. Claudius built roads, expanded the empire into Britain, and reformed the legal system. He also married his niece, which, okay, not great, and that niece, Agrippina the Younger, ambitious with a capital A, she poisoned Claudius, allegedly with mushrooms, to place her own son, Nero, on the throne. Black. At first, promising, he lowered taxes, supported the arts, and gave stunning public performances of himself, playing the lyre. Then paranoia, executions, murders, his own mother, dead, his wife, dead. Rome caught fire in 64 CE, and while Nero probably didn't fiddle, he also didn't help. He did, however, build himself a massive golden palace on the ashes. Priorities. He blamed the fire on Christians, marking the start of their persecution. It didn't help his popularity. Eventually, rebellion broke out. Provinces rose up. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Nero fled, and when capture seemed certain, he asked his servant to help him end his life. His last words: "What an artist dies in me." Modest to the end. With Nero's death, the Julio-Claudian line ended. Rome spiraled into a year of 4 emperors, where generals scrambled for power, cities burned, and soldiers auctioned off the empire to the highest bidder. Spoiler: stability didn't win, but eventually, one man rose, Vespasian, a soldier, a no-nonsense leader. He brought peace, rebuilt Rome, and began construction on the Colosseum, a gift to the people, and finally, it felt like Rome could breathe again. The streets of Rome had seen chaos before. Fires, riots, emperors being dragged through them. But under Vespasian, something rare bloomed: resilience. He didn't dazzle. He wasn't poetic. In fact, he was famously gruff. His dying words were, "I think I'm becoming a god," followed by a smirk. But Vespasian restored something deeper than glory: normalcy. After him came his son Titus, who faced a horror no emperor could have truly prepared for: the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE. Pompeii and Herculaneum vanished beneath ash. Thousands died. And Titus, he poured imperial funds into relief efforts. He opened his palace to refugees. He even skipped dinner parties. That's how you know it was serious. Historians still debate whether Rome's response to the disaster was effective or merely symbolic. But one thing was clear: Titus cared. Too bad he only lasted 2 years. He died young, mourned deeply. The people even called him the delight of the human race. Try fitting that on a coin. His brother Domitian, though, not so delightful. Domitian believed in control. Absolute, micromanaged, suffocating control. He wanted statues, titles, divine status, and he ruled with paranoia. He executed senators, silenced critics, and surrounded himself with spies. Eventually, the people closest to him removed him. He was assassinated in his palace, in his slippers. No heroic last stand, just a well-placed dagger, and the empire quietly moved on. The next century brought the so-called 5 good emperors, a rare streak of competent, thoughtful rulers who actually seemed to like their jobs. Think of it as Rome's golden age 2.0. Under Trajan, the empire reached its maximum size. Under Hadrian, they built that famous wall in Britain to keep out angry locals, and possibly the occasional sheep. Under Marcus Aurelius, a philosopher, ruled from the battlefield, writing down thoughts so wise they'd eventually end up in airport bookstores centuries later. Of course, after him came Commodus. Yes, that Commodus, gladiator-obsessed, megalomaniacal, and dangerously unstable. He believed he was Hercules. He fought in the arena-rigged matches, of course, and renamed months after himself. He even wanted Rome to be renamed Colonia Comorgiana. Rolls right off the tongue. Spoiler alert, the Senate didn't love that, so he was strangled in his bath. Classic Roman farewell. The empire lurched forward. More emperors rose. Some were generals, others were puppets. Some ruled for years, others for weeks. The crisis of the 3rd century hit like a thunderclap. Plagues, civil wars, economic collapse. Rome was being pulled apart like old fabric, and everyone had a hand on the thread. And then, just when it seemed the whole thing might fall apart forever, came Diocletian. He was no poet, but he was practical and radical. He split the empire in half, east and west, each with its own emperor. 2 emperors, revolutionary. 4 emperors with junior emperors, genius or madness, depending on who you asked. This tetrarchy brought temporary order. but also planted the seeds of eventual division. Diocletian retired to grow cabbages. Seriously, he turned down a return to power, saying he preferred vegetables to politics. And honestly, who could blame him? Eventually, one man would emerge to reunite the halves. Constantine now. Constantine had vision, and a sign, literally. He reportedly saw a cross in the sky before battle, with the words, "In this sign, conquer." After his victory, he legalized Christianity. A seismic shift. No more lions. No more underground churches. Christianity would go from fringe to favored. He built a new capital, Constantinople, the site of old Byzantium. The East, strong and wealthy, now had its own heartbeat, but the West, Rome itself, it began to crumble. Emperors came and went like bad dinner guests. The Goths, Vandals, Hun tribes the Romans had once mocked now stood at the gates, and sometimes, inside the gates. In 410 CE, Alaric the Goth sacked Rome. It was unthinkable. The Eternal City, violated. Citizens fled. The Senate wailed. For centuries, people would whisper, "Rome has fallen." But had it? In a way, yes. In 476 CE, the last Western Roman emperor, a teenage boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. No grand duel, no blood-soaked battle. Just a letter sent to the Eastern emperor saying, "We're done here." The Eastern Roman Empire, Byzantium, would live on for nearly another 1,000 years. But the West, that was it. The dream of the Republic. The glory of the emperors. The roaring crowds in the Colosseum, all now pages in a fading scroll. And yet, Rome never truly dies. Its laws shaped modern systems. Its roads still lie beneath European highways. Its language echoes in medicine, law, and romance. Its architecture stands proud, defying time, and perhaps, more than anything, its stories endured tales of glory, betrayal, madness, triumph, and the human desire to leave a mark. Because that's what Rome was, not just a city or an empire, but an ideal one too grand to vanish entirely. And now, as we leave behind the roar of the Forum, the clash of legionnaires, and the whispers of emperors, it's time to close the scroll. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let the images of togas, triumphs, and temple columns drift into the quiet. You are far from the chaos now, far from the marble halls and the Senate's debates. You are safe, wrapped in the silence of history, cradled by the lull of time. Breathe deep. The empire sleeps, and so should you.